And that kind of segues into me. We're going through the book of Nehemiah, and I'm going to kind of camp in chapter 2. But Nehemiah is this great blueprint for when you feel the call of God to do something on your life, kind of how to follow through with that. And so like ragamuffin and showers and the food pantry, all of those started when God put a dream in someone's heart. Liv, I think I remember you telling me, like, when you were a little kid, like, you always dreamed of, like, being able to, like, work someplace where, people could get showers. And Yolanda, who runs Ragamuffin, one day, she just felt like God told her, feed my kids, basically. And like, she's like, okay, well, I don't know what to do. So she just, like, cooked breakfast one morning, and people showed up. And it just kind of grows. It's like, did anybody ever see the movie Field of Dreams? Yes. So like the whole, if you build it, he will come. Yes. That whole thing was like, if you cook pancakes, people will be here. It's like, so like the smell of bacon wafts for blocks. And so people just are drawn to the smell of bacon and sausage patties. But all those things started when God put like a vision on someone's heart, a calling in someone's life. And so in Nehemiah, like I was saying, like the book of Nehemiah is just a great blueprint for hearing, answering, and following through with the call of God in your life. Whether it be planting a church or starting a ministry like Ragamuffin or Showers, or starting a business, or just inviting a coworker or a neighbor to church. Like, God is speaking to you about something, about partnering with him in what he is doing. Sometimes we don't always know how to follow through with that. So what does responding to the call of God look like? What can we learn from Nehemiah? I tell you what, I'm not going to put any verses on the screen, but if you would please turn with me to chapter 2 of Nehemiah. If the little books in the pockets on the pews, it's page 221. I'm being for real. I looked it up earlier. Page 221. Because Nehemiah, listen, I've been around church my whole life, and the Old Testament books are hard for me to find because I don't have a song to go with it. Like the New Testament. How many of you guys, I realize not everybody grew up in church, but if you grew up in church, did you have a song for the books of the Bible? We have for the New Testament, it was like Genesis. It was like Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, Acts and letters to the Romans, like the whole thing. So like, and funny story. Okay, so when I was out of college, I taught at I went to a Bible school. When I got out of college, I taught at a private school in Katy, Texas. And my subjects were Texas history, because I taught 7th grade, and Bible. And the students in my Bible class thought there was a book of the Bible titled Letters Between Acts and Romans. Because the song goes, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, Acts, and a letter to the Romans. And so they thought that there was another book of the Bible in there called Letters. So I was always very entertained by that. I was like, ha ha, you guys are dumb. No, kidding, I did say that. That's the kind of thing that gets you fired as a teacher. Anyway, so Nehemiah chapter 2, it says, in the 9th month of Nisan, that's not really Nisan, but I just like saying it like that. In the 9th month of Nisan, in the 20th year of King Artaxerxes, when wine was before him, I took up the wine and gave it to him. And now I had not been sad in his presence. And the king said to me, why is your face sad, seeing you are not sick? This is nothing but sadness of heart. Then I was very much afraid. So part of seeing, hearing, and following through with the call of God on your life is just being available. Nehemiah was in a position to be available for God to use him for this very specific call. And what's awesome is if you read the scriptures, God has a track record of using very unlikely candidates to do very awesome things in his kingdom. There wasn't really anything special about Nehemiah. He wasn't like this big, great political leader. He wasn't a big, strong warrior. But what he was is he was a man who had a dream for his people, and he was available. And so one of the things that I heard in a sermon years ago that stuck with me, there's a guy by the name of Tommy Tenney. He wrote this book called God Chasers, and I was in a church service where he was preaching, and this wasn't even one of his main points. But he had said at some point in the sermon, almost in passing, he said, God will oftentimes preposition you for his favor in your life. He will often preposition you for his plan and for his purpose. And so that just kind of stuck with me all these years, because sometimes we feel like we're not accomplishing anything. Sometimes we feel like we're forgotten or left behind. And sometimes in God's plan for our lives, it requires us to be patient. It requires us to be quiet. It requires us to rest. And as like a middle-aged American male, being still and quiet and resting is not part of what I've been programmed to do. Like we've been programmed to like produce constantly. Like I fidget. I'm super ADHD anyway, and so like I don't sit still very well anyway. But being patient and waiting on God is a very, very difficult thing to do. But if you can just like kind of like cage whatever that is, craziness in your brain, and kind of like slow down, God can do some really great things. And, I think about the showers and like us being very patient with the way things went. No matter how much anxiety I had of like, or how impatient I was getting, listening to God and letting him do things his way turned out so much better than any other way that we could have done it on our own. So God will often preposition you for his favor, kind of like the story of Esther. These few books in the Bible were, they're kind of like the history of how God has moved through his people. Like Esther, again, was just someone who just wasn't anything super special about her, but she was available and she was willing. And all these boring, seemingly mundane events lined up in her life perfectly to be able to save her people from what was essentially annihilation, right? And so, I heard there's a phrase that I've heard used for stuff like that. It's called the miracle of the mundane. And sometimes following God and waiting on God looks very, very boring, but there's also a lot of beauty in it, being patient and resting and waiting. So, one of these little sayings that you'll hear every now and then tossed around is like, your greatest ability is your availability. God is looking for people who are able, like, another one of those is like, God doesn't call the equipped, he equips the called. It's like, me personally, I generally kind of feel like I'm an old talent hack, but still just being able and willing, I've been able to do some really cool things partnering with God in ministry and partnering with others. And so your availability, your willingness, your heart, your character, all those things are more important to God than your raw ability. Part of being available is being ready. I mentioned being patient. We have a phrase we use around here often called waiting aggressively. So like waiting on God doesn't mean that you just kind of turn everything off. It just means that you're being purposefully patient in perpetuity and perpendicular to the, I'm sorry. I kept that going as long as I could. But, being, very intentional about being patient, but also waiting, and so and kind of like we're going to see that Nehemiah had done the same thing. Like Nehemiah was kind of ready to take action. Like he had a call on his heart. And then most importantly, we seek God and we pray. Continue on in verse 4. Let me find my spot here. It says, "Then the king said to me, 'What are you requesting?' So I prayed to the God of heaven. And I said to the king, 'If it pleases the king, and if your servant has found favor in your sight, that you send me to Judah, to the city of my father's graves, that I may rebuild it.' And the king said to me, 'How long will you be gone, and when will you return?' So it pleased the king to send me when I had given him a time, and said to the king, 'If it pleases the king, give me letters.'" So, I'm going to kind of brush over that. But, Nehemiah, he was there, he was available, and he was in a spot to be used by God. And when the king asked him, "What do you need to do this thing that you feel like you need to do?" he was very clear. So kind of the second thing that we learned from Nehemiah and following the call of God in our lives is be clear. Like Nehemiah, he was clearly kind of a smart dude because, he he lists off all these things he needs. Like basically, he's like, I'm going to need a passport. I'm going to need letters to the governors of these regions that I'm going to encounter. I'm going to need permission from the keeper of the king's forest to cut down some trees. I'm going to need some money for material. I'm going to be gone for this period of time. Nehemiah was very, very, very clear on what he needed to accomplish the task that God had called him to, and being very clear made it an easy yes for the king. So if we clearly define what God has asked us to do, clearly define what we need to complete the task, being clear helps you pray. Being clear helps you ask. And being clear helps you encourage others, specifically to join with you in the task. In kind of studying for this, I saw this quote that says, for most people, it's not lack of caring that's the problem, it's lack of clarity. Like, it's hard to, I guess, accomplish something if you're always flying by the seat of your pants. And trust me, I'm a seat of the pants kind of guy. Like, I'm not good at planning, but I have learned, through the shower project and through other things, I've learned that like a little bit of planning goes a long way. So being very clear on what you need to accomplish a task is tremendously helpful. Continuing along in verse 9, it says, Then I came to the governors of the province beyond the river and gave them the king's letters. And now the king had sent me with officers and army and horsemen. And so if you just kind of read through that passage through verse 16, it talks about how Nehemiah, he encountered the governors of these regions, and then he went out in the night to kind of take inventory of the wall. And he did some very, very intentional, very specific things. So the third thing we learn from Nehemiah here is, and following the call of God, is being intentional. How many of y'all have been in and worked in like construction? And there's a difference between like estimating a job and doing the job, right? Like when you're telling the customer that you're going to like build a deck or whatever, like, yeah, I'm pretty sure I'm going to need, unless you've just built 1,000 decks, which a lot of those guys have, but you even the estimating of the job and actually buying the material are often two different things. And Nehemiah, he was kind of in that situation. He knew what he would need to build this wall, but he hadn't been there in a while, and so like he needed to kind of survey the land. So he got there, and very quietly, he kept it super on the DL. He organized his tasks. He kind of started taking inventory and checking things out. He was very intentional about how, and even it says here, and I told no one what my God had put into my heart. Sometimes when we have plans, and sometimes when God is like calling us to do something, our initial thought, our initial response is, well, I got to put this on Facebook, right? I got to put this on Twitter or on Instagram. Like I'm gonna do these great things for God. People have to know about it. I was listening to this podcast. This author John Acuff was talking about, he does all kinds of stuff, but one of his hobbies is running. And he was training for a half marathon, and he was talking about the dynamic of sharing about something like that on Facebook before you do it actually lessens the odds or lessens the chances of you actually do it. So like in the case of like running a marathon, if you post on Facebook, hey, I'm going to sign up for my first marathon, and people are like, oh man, you're so awesome, you're so brave, I could never do that. Like you start getting the benefits and the congratulations of doing said thing before you actually do it. And so actually kind of your chances of doing it go down because you've already gotten the reward for it. And so what they found in doing some of this research is like when you post a lot of this stuff on social media, you get all the pats on the back and the congratulations, and then you're less likely to follow through. So sometimes keeping your plans and keeping what God is calling you to on the DL is a good thing because it eliminates distractions. It keeps you motivated. It keeps you focused. The other thing it does, it lessens the chance for haters to come in and give you discouragement. In this passage of scripture, Nehemiah talks about how he faced opposition, specifically from like the governors of these regions. And so kind of keeping this stuff, close to the chest lessens the chances of someone saying, oh, you can't do that. That's going to be too hard. Or that's going to be too expensive, or that's going to take too long. Like, man, I know it's going to be hard. Stop telling me that. So just kind of keeping that stuff quiet intentionally and being very intentional about what you're doing helps you stay focused, helps you be patient, and it helps kind of eliminate the chances of someone really coming in and discouraging you too much. But Nehemiah was very intentional about what he was doing. He made a plan. There's this saying that says, plan the work and work the plan. And I mentioned before, like, I'm not really much of a planner, but I tell you, like a little bit of planning goes a long way. It's really, really helpful. All right, verse 17, skipping down to verse 17, it says, then I said to them, you see the trouble we're in, how Jerusalem lies in ruins and its gates burned. Come, let us build the wall of Jerusalem. That way we may no longer suffer derision. And I told them of the hand of my God had been upon me for good, and also the words of the king that had spoken to me. And they said, let us rise up. And so they strengthened their hands for the good work. And so, he goes, so another thing that we can do when we're following the call of God, and the last thing is, it's being an inspiration to others. Rally the troops, encourage others to come around you, to join you. Things like this, things like anything, like, ragamuffin in the showers and worship team and rep your recovery, all these things, you're not meant to do it alone. You can't do it alone. You shouldn't do it alone. A big part of walking out a faithful life and following Christ is doing it with others. Nehemiah rallied a team around him. They prepared. One of the best ways to share the gospel with someone, to disciple someone, is to have them participate with and in what God has called you to do. And that with word is really powerful, because Jesus was with his disciples. He prayed with his disciples. He grieved with his disciples. He ate with his disciples. So one of the best ways to share the gospel and disciple someone is to have them participate with the calling God has placed on your life. Years ago, I was watching this documentary about missionary work, and one of the people being interviewed said something that really stuck out to me. He said, find the hard things God is calling you to do and do them. And out of that came one of these sayings that I kind of used in youth ministry, and I'd used in some other stuff. It was like, dream big dreams and do hard things. Like, when God places a call in your life, it's not going to be easy. Things that are worth it seldomly are. How many of you guys have watched the show Scrubs? Okay, just a few guys. I'm so sorry. Anyway, there's a scene. Scrubs is one of those shows that, like, it'll make you laugh and cry and ponder in 30 minutes. It's so great. Anyway, like, there's one scene where, like, someone's talking about, what if, like, doing something, like, what if this is really hard? And the guy said, then that means it's worth it. Like, things that are easy, or things that are worth it seldomly come easy. And that's kind of like, when God has placed a big dream on your life, like, it's going to be tough. You're going to, like, come against opposition. You're going to face discouragement. And much like Nehemiah, he faced opposition in this journey. Later, they're like, Dr. E's probably going to share next week, but they were like working with like tools in one hand and a sword in the other hand type of thing. So things are going to be hard, but God was calling Nehemiah to do something big. Nehemiah had a dream of returning Jerusalem to its former glory. Nehemiah didn't have special education, special upbringing, special privileges. He was just available and willing. He had a dream and a burden for his people and for his city. And that's kind of like us here at the sanctuary. Like, for the most part, we're just a bunch of misfits and doing the call of God. And we have a burden for God's kids, and we have a burden for the city. The scriptures are full of stories of God using ordinary people to do great things. A bunch of nobodies and misfits. Paul was a persecutor of Christians, and God used him to write, the majority of the New Testament, right? God has a history of using unlikely candidates to do extraordinary things. Heck, even Jesus came from humble beginnings, right? The people of Israel were expecting like this great and powerful and mighty king, and he was born at, pretty much the most humble beginnings you can imagine. So as I'm wrapping up, I'll invite the worship team to come back up. My challenge to you, or my question to you, is this: like, what is God calling you to do? Now, the answer is not nothing. As followers of Christ, we're all to participate. We're all to join in the work of the kingdom. We're all to join in the work of sharing the gospel with others, serving others, feeding God's kids, helping God's kids get a shower once a week. We are all called to something. And so my challenge to you is tonight, as you pray, this week as you go about your normal daily life, be thinking, be listening. Sometimes that requires being very still and being very intentional. But you're going to have to be available to God. Now, if you're saying like, oh, well, I don't really know what God's calling me to do. I don't feel any like clear direction. A lot of times we have like passion and interests that are in us already. A lot of times those things can kind of direct you to what God is calling in your life. And then sometimes you just still feel lost. And so my encouragement to you would be, if you can't discern anything, just start doing something. And like through that you will find volunteer at like kids church or something. You're like, oh man, I realized pretty quick that me and kids don't get along. Okay, that's fine. Don't do kids church anymore. Move to the next one. Come help with food pantry. Come help with showers. Come help with ragamuffin. Help on the greeter team. If you can't discern or think of anything that you feel like God is calling you to do, just do something. And God will speak to you, and God will use those experiences, and maybe he'll just introduce you to the right person to kind of point you in the right direction. You know, I mentioned you not being able to do these things alone. When I came to the sanctuary, one of my dreams was to be able to provide showers. But I didn't know how, I didn't know where, I didn't even know where to start. But I knew that like that's something God was calling us to do. And so I would tell as many people as I could, like, I don't know how to start this, but I want to do this. And eventually God sent to our church, someone who did know how to do those things. And so, you know, the two of us partnered up. Honestly, he did all the work. I just took all the credit, which was pretty cool. But so if God is calling you to something, just know that he's going to place the people in your life to help fulfill this calling, to help chase this calling. And sometimes you just have to do before you know, right? So anyway, there's plenty of room up here to stand and pray. But I challenge you guys, find what God is calling you to do. Find those hard things God is calling you to do and go do them.
Thanks for tuning in to a message from the Sanctuary Church. For more information and media, go to our website at thesanctuarywestside.org or follow us on Facebook, Twitter, or YouTube.